I just put that up for interest. It does say Russians rule satellites by torture and murder. That was 1952 that this front page headline occurred in the Washington Post. I might get back to that subject a little bit. This is who I am, Richard Thieme from ThemeWorks. I've been addressing the issues we're going to talk about today for about 21 years. And it occurred to me in the 1980s that because people were going to be hooking computers to each other and that a human being would be connected to all the computers, the world was about to change in a dramatic and radical way. And I began focusing on looking at all the issues that was going to raise for people across the board. And this is what I discovered. It's no wonder how complicated things get, what with one thing leading to another. The entanglement of all aspects of our lives, from identity as individual people, all the way up to geopolitical structures, nation states, and beyond, has been transformed. And when we begin dealing with security, let me see if I can get that off. When we begin dealing with security, what we discover is that we are walking on a Mobius strip. The Mobius strip, as you know, looks like it has two sides. We don't want that. This is going to be fun. It only has one side. You start walking down one side and you wind up coming back on the other side and you discover there's no way to get off the Mobius strip. This is what has happened since World War II. In what we call in the United States the national security state, where the practices of information management, disinformation, misinformation, propagandizing on behalf of our points of view began to be the norm, and the national security state in the United States in the late 1940s, which is where I focus, began to emerge with the institution of the CIA, which has grown now. We have 16 different well-known, publicized intelligence units doing intelligence, the CIA and the NSA and the DIA and so on. And therefore it means the information space, which it is your obligation and task to secure, is not always what we think it is. And people change their thinking with a great deal of difficulty. It also has become necessary in the national security state to talk about things in a kind of a different kind of way in order to make sure that, unlike Mr. Snowden, you still can travel freely and live where you want. I'm going to show you something. You won't be able to read this easily, so I'm going to tell you what it is. In 2006, I wrote a short story, and it was called Break Memory, and I wrote one called Zero Day Roswell. Zero Day Roswell, which this is from, and these are all from this collection called Mind Games, which looks like this. Well, it doesn't look like that. That's an iPad doing that. You know how that works. There it is. Mind Games is a collection of short stories, and the question you can ask is, why did I begin to write short stories? I was working with people who were very much into the intelligence world, and they were very concerned after 9/11 about what had happened to their task. It had been changed radically and in a revolutionary way when orders came from the White House to begin collecting, in effect, everything. And the older people who had been part of NSA for many years were shocked, some of them, because this seemed to violate the law and it seemed to violate the Constitution. And we met for a number of years to discuss the ethical implications of what was taking place. And I addressed this in a short story. I did that because one of the people in our group said to me, you know, you can't ever discuss, of course, what we talk about in these meetings. And then he paused and he said, unless you start writing fiction. Fiction, he said, is the only way you can now tell the truth. I realized this was universally true in the national security state, and I'll give you an example in a little bit of why that has become true. Fiction is the only way you can tell the truth. So this is a photograph of one page from my short story. I didn't make it. It was made by a young hacker who noticed after Snowden's revelations that this paragraph paralleled many of the things Snowden had said, and for good reason. It says, among other things, half the attractions out there, the most attractive attractions, we made. He is speaking as an intelligence agent who is on his deathbed. We've partnered from the beginning with the big guys, don't you see? We built remote access into the chips, into all the hardware, in fact, even printers, as well as the software that's now a platform for the business of the world. We go into telecom networks at the front door. We sniff cables on the ocean floor. We have thousands of redundant sensors to watch everything. And it goes on in that vein. And he noticed that I could write this in a short story because, as my friend advised, this was mind candy, candy for the mind. And entertainment is the best way to move information into the mind of society, because all of your filters, your critical thinking is off when you're watching a movie or reading a book of fiction or even playing a multiplayer game in which various themes have been embedded, which you assimilate or take in without thinking. So we find ourselves in a difficult position when we take a look at the war, the information war that is currently going on, and that's what I want to address specifically. First, I'm going to read a statement from another work of fiction. This is David Ignatius, who was part of the CIA for many years, and I know several people in the CIA who write fiction because for them too, it is the only way you can tell the truth. Everything that you write when you leave the agency has to be vetted or approved by the agency, or you are not allowed to print it. That process is a very sometimes capricious and arbitrary process, and it often matters who you know rather than what you know, whether what you write gets out. Ignatius knew a lot of people, and so he could say things like this. From what I was told, one said, the secret power that operates in the world sounds like a mafia. And he says they are a mafia. The great truth of the 1990s is that the world is run by organized criminals. We don't like to admit that in the institution where I work. We like to pretend that the world is run by governments, which have neat little boundaries and their own currencies and stamps and intelligence services and police forces. Those were the rules of the game during the Cold War. But the rules have changed. Power has slipped from governments into the hands of private organizations. In New York, private currency traders have more power over the dollar than the Federal Reserve. In Russia, the mafia has more power than the army. In Mexico, the drug cartels have more power than the president. In Japan, the politicians are a front. The real power is held by corporations and the Yakuza. The same in France. Real power around the world does not reside with governments any longer, but with private interests. Real power, he concluded, is secret power. So, if that's the world in which we live, then it behooves us to be very, very mindful and alert and conscious of how we pursue information, and then when we get bits and pieces of information, how we connect it to other pieces in order to build a bigger and bigger picture. Because Ignatius is really telling the simple truth. Let me give you an example from the United States. I was doing a talk not too long ago for the FBI. It was three of our states had a conference together. And I mentioned that one of the consequences of the computer revolution in the aggregate, in total, is that boundaries which define our identities have gotten very amorphous, very blurry, very porous, very open. You see, an identity is simply the way you put a boundary around yourself and present yourself from within it. You define yourself. And the boundaries around individuals and nations, nation states, have gone liquid. They have gone into mist. And new emergent properties unite the arbiters of power, as Ignatius said, in transnational or supranational organizational structures which don't even have names. We don't know how to refer to them. We certainly don't vote for them. An example that I gave in my talk to the FBI was that the CIA was originated in 1947, I believe it was, as an agency that could do whatever it really could do anywhere in the world outside the United States. But it was prohibited from functioning in that way inside the United States. The FBI, on the other hand, was a police organization, a bureau of police. And it was commissioned to function only within the United States and not outside. But as a result of the changing boundaries, as a result, above all, of the IT revolution and other factors which have transformed our relationships with each other around the world, the CIA now operates inside the United States, for example, in close partnership counterterror with the New York Police Force or with the U.S. Marshal Service, and the FBI now has offices all over the world and operates globally. This results in some changing behaviors. I said that we used to be able to count on our nation, our nationality, our identity from our nation and nationality to tell us how to behave. But now the power and influence that genuinely changes, alters, or motivates our behavior comes from these other sources, these transnational sources. And when I said that, the head of the Chicago office of the FBI said, bingo, bingo. And that's how I know I'm onto something. He said, that's exactly what I am finding. He said, we used to be able to ask people to cooperate with us, Americans, that is, on the basis of patriotism and their loyalty to us. And now, he said, what I often hear is, I would like to help you, but. And that but is the proof of what I just said. That but is a way of saying, but there are other sources of power and influence that shape and frame my behavior and motivate me. And therefore, the large, for example, corporations of the world, like Microsoft or Apple or Sony, or you name them, you know their names. The large corporations are not nation-state corporations. We have a bank called the Bank of America, but it's not the Bank of America, it's in the world. Like Citigroup has 70,000 employees in dozens of countries all over the world. They are global transnational structures. And so I saw a wonderful book Mark Berry wrote in Australia called Jennifer Government, in which people recognized that the source of their identity came so much more from who they worked for than from their country, that they changed their surnames. So Jennifer Government, Robert Nike, Bob Microsoft were the names of people, because that had more to do with who they were. So someone said long ago, the weakest link in the security chain is the definition of the problem. And the definition of the problem is often not what we think it is. And I find that this is also true of identity. The weakest link in who we think we are, fundamentally, is the definition of who we think we are, and it's not who we often think we are on the basis of 20th century thought. The way we were framed and formed by prior cultural and social factors. Now, you know this, you should know this better than anyone. I have some family who came from Poland, pay very close attention. History, you know, the narrative of history is a weapon, and how you tell it to yourselves and how you tell it to others will determine how they think of themselves and with whom they identify. In my family, there was a joke my great-grandmother told of a time when she was a little girl in eastern Poland, and she ran into the house and said, Mama, Mama, we're not Russians anymore. Now we're Poles. When the border changed, and the response came back, thank God, I couldn't have stood another Russian winter. Okay, that's a test to see if my English is doing all right. So, who we think we are is something you know more deeply. If there were, I see mostly young people here, but if there were older people, the specter of memory would shadow their awareness of how their identity from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and so on has changed radically as a result of these emergent structures that are new. So, this defines how we wage war in the information space. Security is a wonderful name for an industry which is selling something that it can never completely deliver. That means you'll have jobs forever, as long as you call it security, because everyone wants security. Well, you know the gate is locked, but the gate is not secure. Fragmented operations are being run for social media. I'm going to talk a little about the Russians and about ISIS. You know the forms attacks can take. There are 4 distinct kinds: physical on physical, physical on digital, digital on physical, and digital on digital. And who wages these attacks? You have your own units and your own specialized cadres of people who engage in warfare and counter-warfare on the levels of information. But more and more, they are mercenaries. They come from the places that could pay them in the first place, as Ignatius said, which means from cartels or from mafias or from organized crimes, and they are creating and executing APTs, or what we call advanced persistent threats. A word in the America security world is almost as disreputable as cyber, but you know what it means. It means something, an execution of an attack that doesn't ever quit. Well, they do this, APTs, as contract work, including creating arsenals of payloads for future use. So the waging of cyber war and the building of information warfare weaponry parallels the physical world, where we amass more weaponry than we need, and therefore where it becomes essential to use it up so that we can make money making more. It became clear that one of the beneficiaries of the Vietnam War was Bell Helicopter, because every time a helicopter went down, and there were about 500 of them that went down during Vietnam, they had to make another one. So the question of who profits really kind of matters. And it's difficult to keep in mind what security really is. Let me give you a quote from someone that I knew pretty well. He said, "The problem is, in computer security, to tell the truth, one has to," and I hope I don't offend anyone by saying this, because I'm quoting someone. This is not me. This is a hacker. I'm sorry, not a hacker. This is a security professional that I know well. He says, "The problem is that to tell the truth, you have to, 1, not be a vendor, not selling any solution, and 2, be willing to spill the beans, tell the truth about how much you get owned. There are very few people," he said, "who are willing to get up and say, 'I work security. My job is to prevent intrusions. We get owned a lot, so I fail. I really suck at my job. Sometimes it is really, really bad, and this is how we deal with it.'" All right, that's a different version of security than we usually see on the material that people put out. Russian organized crime, as you know, is protected by global big crime and by the state security apparatus, the FSB having it segued from the KGB in a kind of seamless way. The Russian influence in the Baltic states is similar to what the Romans built many years ago. What did the Romans discover was the most important thing about building, sustaining, and maintaining an empire? It was roads. It was roads into Crimea, roads into the Ukraine, roads across the frontier. That applies to digital roads as well. That's what APTs are. They are hundreds of roads into complex systems, which once you take them, put you inside what we used to consider the perimeter. But there is now no longer a perimeter. So how you talk about this is itself the weapon. I'm telling some of the harsher truths in order to say we have to begin with reality, because if you do not begin with reality, you have to spend a lot of time and effort to get to it. And then you've wasted energy and time going from unreality to reality so that you can begin to have a sensible, meaningful conversation. Philip K. Dick, great writer, said, reality is that which, when you no longer believe in it, refuses to go away. And that's what I try to stay with. So what is happening in reality? ISIS is building cohesion and identity by targeting youth through manipulation and through images. We have well-meaning hackers who want to fight back in the States, vigilante hackers, Anon and their legions of cooperative supporters. But hackers are effective in this war only if they are integrated into a bigger strategy. Otherwise, it's very clear that, using ISIS as an example, with 35,000 tweets a day, you're playing what we call whack-a-mole. You know, one comes up here, take down the video. One comes up here, take down the video. It comes up here. That's a very ineffective way to do it. But it's even worse than that. We have to be clear about how it is that the national security state globally really operates. I was sitting with a friend once upon a time when a document came across my computer, and it mentioned that vigilante hackers were attacking Al-Qaeda websites with a vengeance, and the Al-Qaeda websites showed themselves to be surprisingly resilient and elastic. They would come back up very quickly, and they didn't think they could do that so well. Well, my friend that I was sitting with happened to be a career employee at the NSA, and he just smiled and he said, look, those guys don't know how to code. We have to go behind the scenes and rewrite the code for their websites, and we have to install perimeter defenses to make sure the vigilantes do not take down the Al-Qaeda websites. That's counterintuitive, but why was it that he said that? Because it's much more important. If the website is a water hole, you want to watch the animals go to it. You want to watch where they drink, and then you want to watch where they go when they leave the water hole. The only way to degrade a cell is by attacking the units of the cell that make up the network. Excuse me. So, the units that make up the network are people, links in the chain. And you can do this by attacking this link that is very unimportant and making it seem much bigger and more important, or attacking an important link and making it seem much smaller, so that the energy that has to be continually put into maintaining the network of information and its flow is considerably more than it would otherwise be. So things are often not what they seem. In fact, things are seldom what they seem. And in the national security state, that's even truer. So, how are the Russians doing their job today? I would say they're doing it very well. We have seen this before. We have seen this in the 1930s coming from the other direction, not from your west, but from the east. We have seen ideological saturation of the Russian people to such a degree that there is an 80% approval rating for all the adventurism that is underway right now. When you are saturated with ideological propaganda, you cannot resist it. NATO has monitors who have to read all of this stuff in order to keep up on how the distortions are promulgated. And what we've discovered is that those who read what the Russians are putting out, watch the television programs, read the newspapers, etc., in order to know how the Russians are distorting the information space, even though they know that's their job, is to identify disinformation, inevitably they assimilate, take in what they are reading, and they themselves have to be periodically debriefed in order to help them realize that they have come to believe the very propaganda they are charged or tasked to monitor, because the fact is that when you see a movie, it looks like reality, and your brain does not make a significant distinction between what it sees and what it thinks it sees. It has to treat it like reality if it looks like reality. And so they do a wonderful job, an entertaining way of providing the news. Fiction, as I said, is the only way to tell the truth. They do that expertly. And then it goes down easily. And propaganda is always some truth, spliced with some half-truth, spliced with some lies. And then as you eat the truth, it's kind of like the fat around the ham. You get the lies as well. And it makes it much more easy to assimilate and integrate with what you already believe. So, the Russians, for example, in Sweden, talking to people from the counterintelligence group in Sweden not long ago, there are pro-Russian bloggers in Sweden. Actually, there are dozens and dozens of bloggers who are pro-Russian and paid to be so in Sweden. But they use only one persona. If you go to the blog, it looks like it's just one person blogging, but it's many, many people. You know that on the web, you tend to believe what you see, but you know it isn't true. Let me give you an example. Many years ago, when I started writing about this, so long ago that when you got an email, you thought it came from someone in your town, in your city. That's how long ago it was. People didn't realize that email could come from anywhere. And I was just beginning to write globally in the early 90s because the internet made it available. People forget that in America in 1993, that was the first year you could do something commercial on the internet. It had not been legal to do business on the internet before 1993, and that was only 22 years ago. And so I began to locate markets for my writing in England and in South Africa, where I wrote for 3 years, and Australia and Canada and so on. And someone in England read a piece I did on backgrounding and being a detective online and finding things out. That was a new idea then. Now everybody is a detective in a counterintelligence agency. So he had read it in an English magazine published in London, so he assumed I lived in London, and he sent an email saying, come over after work for a pint. We'd like you to work for us. And I said, what have you got? Well, this turned out to be a global public relations company. And he said, we'd like to see you do brand defense on the web for our clients. And I said, oh, so you mean if, for example, they're a tobacco company, you want me to set up a website defending the company? And he said, no, 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 no. We want you to set up a website attacking the company. And then we'll give you just enough information to make it credible, but nothing that will incriminate or really penalize our client. And that way, those who want to attack the company will go to that website and we will collect them. My words were like real birds in a digital cage. And when you are a real bird collected in a group online, you don't see because you can flap your wings and fly, so you have the illusion of freedom. And you don't see that all they have to do then is move the cage. And all the birds in the cage move along with it. And that's what they offered then. And he said, we want you to go into what we called Usenet groups then. Some of you who know the history of the internet will recognize what a Usenet group is. We used to send little messages to each other and they would form a list. A novel idea then. He said, we want you to create multiple identities under multiple names, and that way you can sway the conversation, or if it gets too close to something dangerous, troll, undermine it, make it about something else. And the problem is that people go on the internet, the people I know who are what I call normal people, not like you guys. Normals don't distinguish between what seems to be true and what is true. In security, we do not have the luxury of doing that. So the means of influence activities are protected and legal in democracies and not allowed in dictatorships. So you can do in Sweden, you can do in Poland, you can do in the United States what you cannot do in Russia because it's not tolerated. And they don't fool around. You know, I know a young hacker in Israel. It's very good. He developed a program. You know, when you go back to Israel as a Jew, you have the right to return, and you're given like $10,000 it was then for a year and settled and helped. And of course, this is a great opportunity for fraud. All you have to do is create multiple identities of people coming back and collect $10,000 per identity. So this fellow, a good, well-meaning hacker, created a program to detect those fraudulent identities and distinguish them from real identities. And a knock came on his door one night, and there were two very large Russian gentlemen, and one of them was silent, and the other said, "We don't like your program." And he said, "You know, I don't like my program." And they said, "Why don't you destroy your program?" And he said, "Why don't I destroy my program?" In other words, the Russians have a very simple way of approaching these matters. Two very large gentlemen show up, and that takes care of the problem. It's not sophisticated mind-washing, brainwashing that's going on. It's the same old thuggery, but it's done at a very sophisticated level. Now I'm going to, let's see if I have time. I'll try to make this quick, but it's, I think, extremely interesting. When you talk about brainwashing, you probably have heard of the Manchurian Candidate. In the 1950s, the United States became very alarmed at the number of American servicemen and women being turned by the Russians and the Chinese when they were captured during the Korean War. And they became convinced that there were sophisticated methods of brainwashing being undertaken, and we needed to know what those were. There was a big article written by an investigative reporter in the United States about brainwashing, and it got the word and the concept into the mind of American society. And so the Americans, taking as their stimulus this well-written article about brainwashing, began exploring how you could do it. So through the 50s and 60s, we developed programs that are now notorious. Project Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra, and the rest of the names we have given them, in which we experimented with human beings, sometimes doing horrific or lethal things to them. We did it in Montreal in order to have plausible deniability for the CIA that conducted the experiments, which sometimes attempted to completely wipe the consciousness of an unwitting volunteer and see if it could be replaced with a Manchurian Candidate type consciousness. We only know that we did all these things because when the director of CIA ordered all reference to these programs destroyed, they overlooked one big box of 50,000 financial documents which have been painstakingly reconstituted to show the narrative so we know what was done. What we discovered was that you couldn't do these things. There were no exotic, sophisticated technologies then for brainwashing. The Russians did what the Russians always did, and the Chinese were doing what the Chinese always did. You can turn people. At the NSA, a friend said, the reason we have compartmentalization is because everybody talks. When they get you, they do things to you, and you talk. And everybody knows that. Therefore, we have to limit what you know because you will tell them everything you do know. So, meanwhile, the Manchurian Candidate was the name given to this person brainwashed and sent back to the United States. And it became very popular. Here's a movie with Frank Sinatra. How can you not believe a movie with Frank Sinatra in it? And it became the subject of nonfiction, the search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA, and mind control. Let me just tell you where it wound up. We decided that we needed to protect our people against these terrible methods of mind control that we ourselves had devised. And so a manual was written called the Kubark Manual, and it was written in order to put our own people during preparation through the very interrogation techniques that we feared would be used on them, i.e. torture of various sorts, in order for them to learn how to resist torture. And then after 9/11, when we needed someone to head our own interrogation program, we chose the person who had written that manual which was based in turn on what the CIA and others had done, which had not worked. And that resulted in some of the disasters that we have experienced. Abu Ghraib was one. Before the photographs from Abu Ghraib, which stupid people made, were published, no one had been beheaded in Iraq. It was only after Abu Ghraib and our own photographs were published that had taken place. So the man who wrote that Kubark manual was put in charge of interrogation, which resulted in torture of the people we captured on the grounds that we could find out better that way what was being planned. The head of the Supreme Court, Scalia, in America, even cited Jack Bauer, the fictional hero of the television program 24, as an example of why we ought to do this. No one would incriminate or prosecute Jack Bauer, would they, if he prevented a terrorist attack? And all you could say is, earth to Scalia, Jack Bauer is fiction. But fiction is the only way important truths are disseminated these days into the mind of society. More people believe in Jack Bauer than believe in Joe Biden. More people know who Jack Bauer is than know who Joe Biden is. So let me conclude this story by just pointing out the important fact that investigative reporter in the 1950s who popularized the idea of brainwashing was a CIA agent. And in fact, he wrote that article not because brainwashing was real, which he had no knowledge of because it didn't exist, but in order to escalate the funding of the Cold War and weaponry on behalf of the military-industrial complex. That was his task. He wrote a false article, placed it in the New York Times, and as a result, a whole chain of events subsequently issued from that about a concept that was frightening and numerous, glowed with terrible implications, called brainwashing, that never existed in the first place and that had been written about for an ulterior purpose, which was to raise more money to fund the weaponry of the Cold War in the 1950s. And that's just what happens to articles in the information space, which is why you have to be extraordinarily careful and a counterintelligence agent yourself in order to have some sense of what's going on, because the battlefield today in the global structures in which we live is the mind of society. And the arsenal is information, and how it is manipulated, and how it is disseminated, and how it is reinforced is critical to what we do with it. Sometimes those articles, I see, 10 minutes? Okay. I'm just getting to my introduction, so hold on, because I'm going to do 3 hours of work in 10 minutes. I'm going to show you a picture. Let's put it down. Okay. On one side of the screen, you see a rat. And on the other side, you have a little fuzzy mouse. Okay? Thank you. That's just a cheap shot, right? I won't tell the whole story why these two are juxtaposed, but I will tell you that the gentleman on the right is Alexander Haig, who was a general and became Secretary of State. And he became very alarmed when he read a story in the New York Times about a book that illuminated how much the KGB at that time was supporting global insurrection around the world through terrorism. And he held a press conference demanding that the CIA look into it and counter the nefarious attempts of the KGB to undermine every legitimate movement all over the world. He was very impulsive. You may remember that when Reagan was shot, he popped up and he said, "I'm in charge, don't worry." And then people said to him, "No, you're not. You're number 5 on the list. There are 4 people ahead of you who are in charge, and only if they are shot will you be in charge. And if they are all shot, we will make sure one more is shot. You can count on it." So he got very excited and insisted the CIA take a look at this. Well, the CIA did, and this is what the CIA discovered, because it discovered what it had already known. He had read this about this book in the New York Times. Very, very good, right? The book was based on an article written by investigative reporters in the New York Times. They took their lead from an article published in a small Italian newspaper. And to make the story short, the small Italian newspaper was a proprietary of the CIA, and the article was written by the CIA as propaganda and put in the article to stir up exactly what got stirred up, the belief that the KGB was fostering these various terroristic attacks around the world, which they were not. But Haig didn't know that, and so the information had moved all the way from a bogus article in an Italian newspaper written by and placed by the CIA, all the way up to the New York Times and a book, to the Secretary of State calling a press conference so the CIA could come back 6 months later and say, we've investigated thoroughly and we've got it. We've got your back. Don't worry about it. Well, there was nothing to worry about in the first place because it wasn't happening. And that's the danger of misunderstanding the way blowback, as we call it, information that we place all over the world for other purposes, follow the money is the usual rule, can wind up like that. I had put this on the screen when we came in. It interested me that there was, in 1952, articles like Russians Rule Satellites by Torture and Murder. But the reason I had it is I do a whole talk, and I'll just show you these. If you want to see these afterward, I always have a few if somebody wants to buy one. When you sell them in zlotys, it sounds like so much more than in dollars. But I was part of a team that wrote this book. It's a huge book. It's in 65 university libraries around the world, and it's called UFOs in Government, A Historical Inquiry. What our team illuminates is the government and how the government responded to UFOs over 50 or 60 years from the 1940s to the 1980s. The other book is Mind Games, which you can look at as well, that short story collection. We've worked for over 50 years in order to show that the practices of cover and deception were effectively applied to the domain of UFOs, which the government knew. I'm not saying we know what they are. I'm not speculating. Our book does not speculate. The reason it's so solid is because it has over 1,000 footnotes pointing, or almost 1,000, pointing to government documents or other primary documents. The data in the book is bulletproof. It's a work of history focusing how the government interpreted the threat to national security, which was primarily reports of UFOs rather than the phenomena itself. Let's leave it at that without going into detail, and therefore began to damp down the phenomena itself. This was one of the triggering events that caused that in 1952, July. This is the Washington Post. This is not some sluggard newspaper. This is a headline in the Washington Post. The fact is, and I'll just do these quickly, the fact is that's the Alexandria Gazette, that's the Miami Herald, Spot 8 Saucers. I'm just showing you real news because in the early 50s and late 40s, Americans got through the medium which said, by using that medium, these newspapers, this is news. This is something you should be aware of. But once the decision was made in the early 50s, in light of serious events over Washington, which I won't have time to go into, you can look at the YouTube video of my talk at DEF CON 2 years ago on the book and on the subject. They decided they needed to do something else. And this is what they wound up doing, using tabloids. UFO aliens found at South Pole, burning up our ozone. And when you juxtapose that with Hooker gives birth to triplets, one black, one white, and one Chinese, even though, I don't know about Poland, but in America, 80% will believe that top headline. Then you tend to say, well, that's ridiculous, therefore that must be ridiculous, and therefore we can't rely on the National Enquirer for the truth. The question, 5 minutes. Okay, the question then becomes, where did the National Enquirer come from? Now, I already told you that the CIA had placed a bogus story in an Italian newspaper about the KGB, but through the 50s and 60s, the CIA appointed itself as a Ministry of Culture because we didn't have one to counteract the Russian Ministry of Culture and Soviet socialist realism in literature and in art. And lifted all boats, the whole information space globally became an outpost. The CIA published over 1,000 books covertly. It made movies like Animal Farm covertly. It arranged for the publication of Dr. Zhivago in the Soviet Union covertly. And it sponsored intellectual periodicals, the one I knew best was Encounter in England, which for about 20 years was the leading non-communist left periodical in the world for intellectuals. And it was from first to last a CIA operation funded through the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and other proprietary foundations that existed in name only with letterheads of important people who were glad to give their names to this patriotic enterprise. Well, in 1953, they sponsored not only these legitimate things, but they also created some disreputable periodicals for the purpose of placing stories in them which would immediately kill the story which was so placed. So the question becomes, for people interested in history, when did the National Enquirer start? And it was 1953. And then the next question is, who started it? His name was Gene Pope, Generoso Pope. The question then is, well, what did he do in 1952? It's in his resume. He was doing psychological operations for the CIA, is what he was doing. Did he make money? Because this was a money-making operation, a business. Not until the 1960s. For many years, he didn't make money. He lost money every year. Well, how did he keep the National Enquirer afloat? Well, hundreds of thousands of dollars came to him through Frank Costello, the head of the mafia family in New York, in cash every year to sustain that. And when he died, did this person publishing this nefarious stuff, who scandalized America, who spoke at his funeral? Well, the eulogy was given by Melvin Laird, who was the Secretary of Defense. In other words, his links never quit. And you can even ask, did UFO stories in the Enquirer sell the story? And the answer is not really, because every week they had a bulletin board on the wall in the office of the National Enquirer showing the headlines and how circulation fluctuated according to different kinds of stories. It was data mining before its time. So they knew very well the stories about celebrities and medical issues and things like that sold much better, but the one article that was over and over again included were UFO stories, not because they sold more papers, but for whatever reason you might imagine. The point I'm just trying to make is, oh, for heaven's sakes, be very, very careful when you encounter information, because the Soviets, for example, do entire theories of science and aim these at think tanks. They use inference attacks by seeding false premises into complex arguments with the intention of helping people arrive at false conclusions. This is all done for what we call reflexive control, to make the other not even realize what is happening, because what you act on, taking in that information, feels to you like voluntary behaviors. Like you are doing it for good reasons, rather than having had a context created which shapes and frames and forms you, because the context becomes content. And the inventors of public relations, and like Eddie Bernays back in the 50s in America, knew this. They changed the context, and then the content would follow. And that's what reflexive control of a population really means. If you can alter what someone believes fundamentally to be true, it becomes the foundation of their house of information. And if you control the paradigm or model of reality within which people live and move and have their being, you don't need to worry about the answers to questions, because you determine what questions can even be asked in the first place. So to go back to this silly example, which isn't silly at all, you mention UFOs, and people scoff and say, oh, come on. But we knew it was real. We knew it was real in the 40s. We knew it was real. It has been real. It is real. We knew that, and we document that. So the best way to attack something people hide in plain sight is through ridicule. Ridicule is a very effective way of undermining the credibility of a human being, like myself or someone else, without even touching the arguments they are making, without addressing what they're saying is true. And if you fundamentally undermine their credibility, like the National Enquirer, then anything they say is going to be rejected as a conspiracy theory. A friend of mine who does cover and deception operations says there are 3 pillars for cover and deception. Illusion, misdirection, and ridicule. Illusion means the creation of events, pseudo-environments in the mind of society in which people nevertheless believe as if they are real. It is an industry, and it is global. 2, sleight of hand means, well, when something is visible and you can't hide it, make people look over here. We have a person in America called Paris Hilton. You ever heard of that person? Paris Hilton is a non-entity who is essentially as close to meaningless as a purposeful human being can get in the way she is living her life. Almost non-human, because there's nothing but shallowness and appearance. Well, she got out of jail early. That was a page 1 story. What we were changing in Iraq was on page 22. So make people look over here. The entertainment industry is rife for creating distractions to which people will be attracted and then follow their noses toward, oh, look at the butterfly, and ignore what is in plain sight. But if you can't hide it at all, and it's right in plain sight, like the thousands of documented instances of UFOs from around the world, from 150 countries, over 50 years, the degree and the small details. And our book includes a wonderful lecture in 1954 from Hermann Ovarth, the father of German rocketry, based on more than 30, he said. If I only had 2 or 3, he said, I couldn't tell you about the ionization of the atmosphere around the vehicle as the increase in power changes the apparent color because it's ionized nitrogen around the vehicle as the intensity of the power source, whatever that force field is, increases. This is a lecture in 1954. He said, I had more than 30 reports. 1954, more than 30 from U.S. Air Force and Navy planes using radar as well as multiple sightings converging on the same spot the radar is in. So what do you do with that? You ridicule people who say it. You say they must be drunk, or it was a balloon, or blah, 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 blah. Well, 600 pages of documented history shows you the government took it seriously and responded as effectively as they could, but the phenomena does not go away. And therefore, you have to ramp up the ridicule until it reaches a point where it is now. Inside, it is a point where the discussion is, shall we confirm? It's not disclosure, because we have the data, a lot of the data anyway. It's shall we confirm what people know? Because it's not what people know that matters most, it's what they know that they know. Everyone knows that's what I'm saying is real, but we don't know that we know it. It takes the authoritative voice to imprint authenticity upon it. And then we say, oh, it's true, instead of, well, yeah, kind of nebulous, anomalous. These anomalies don't connect to anything. They don't change our lives. We're more interested in the price of bread than we are in the fact that the universe is teeming with life, and we are Johnny-come-latelys to the enterprise of civilization. 100 years ago, we didn't have electric lights. 100 years ago, we had gas lamps. We had arc lamps. Now we have electric lights. Only 100 years later, in the middle of the 20th century, we thought the Milky Way was the only universe there was. We thought that was the whole universe. And now we try to get our mind around the meaning of words like billions and billions of galaxies, each of which contains billions and billions of stars, each of which is surrounded by billions and billions of planets, many of which, like us, have spawned life, because we know that when life can happen, it will happen. And the discovery of life, for some of us, is after the fact of the discovery of life. But the truth is, all science goes on this premise. If it happens once, it's interesting. If it happens twice, it's everywhere. So if there's life anywhere else in the universe, and we know that there is, then there's life everywhere. And how does that change the context in which we live? This is going to be the big event of the 20th century coming on. Not that we know it, but that we know it. And therefore it will call into question societal structures premised on the assumption that we are the top of the food chain and the apple of God's own eye. We will have to recontextualize our understanding of who we were and redefine our identities. And we will have to rely on the resilience that has gotten us through so many bad patches in the past. You should be holding up a 0, right?
-5.
-5. I didn't see. All right, so here's advice to you. When you're giving a speech, make sure that the person who holds up how many minutes you've got left does not have a -5 or a -10 or a minus anything, and therefore the communication can never be delivered that you better shut up. So, but she has delivered it in very gracious style, so I will shut up. come look at these 2 books. If you want one, we can get you one, but I can also direct you to how you can get one, of course, cheaper on the web. And as someone wrote the other day, hell, we'll just use torrent, man. We'll get all your stuff free. But you guys wouldn't do that. I also have cards here. This is who I am. If any questions come up as a result of this, unfortunately, we've only got an hour to interface, and I'm off to Amsterdam tonight to speak at Haxpo tomorrow. Had a wonderful time in Krakow. This is a great place. And we know who you guys are. I mean, you got us Enigma, right? It was you guys who got Enigma for all of us. And that became critical to making a world in which I could stand here and speak freely to you who can listen freely. We know who you are. You are the unsung heroes of many battles in the past, but we know who you are. So for your hospitality and graciousness, I thank you very much. Pick up a card. Cards are free. And my website is on there. And if there's any information you want based on things you read or videos you see or things I've raised, I'll be around here until this afternoon. Just raise whatever questions you want, okay? Thank you very, very,
Thank you
very
very much. Big applause, please.